Is it Guten Morgen or Guten Tag? Not sure. I'm not going to speak German. But what I did realize is, I'm one of those terrible Americans that travels. So I've been in 15 countries this year. This is my worst travel year ever. And I am so lazy, I never learn the language of any country I go. But when I got here Saturday, I took my son's here. So we took a couple of days vacation. And I realized my mom was German, and like all these things minor things like Guten Tag, Was ist das, all things she used to say to me when I was a little kid. So I was like, I actually speak just a little bit of German. All right, so this is DevOps State of the Union. What I thought I'd do here is, this is going to be a lot of stuff in like 40 minutes. So I had a couple of options. Each year I do a couple of themed presentations, and this is actually going to be kind of all the things I covered this year. So you'll get just a little piece of a lot of stuff. But I will give you a pointer to if you want to find more about all of this stuff, because it's important stuff. In fact, that quote, there was that quote from the Martin Fowler blog, which said that DevOps, even with the right tools, with bad culture will fail. No disrespect to the author of that quote, but they clearly didn't understand DevOps. Because DevOps is and begins with culture. So we'll talk all about that. Because you can't use the word DevOps without culture. So saying that DevOps doesn't work without culture is kind of an oxymoron. My name is John Willis. I've been 35 years IT. A lot of startups. I was actually the ninth person in at Chef. I built their whole customer business. A lot of failed startups. But in the last 3.5 years, the startup gods have been very nice to me. I sold a company to Dell called Instradius. And then I think 9 months ago, this week, I sold a company called Socket Plane to Docker. So I work for Docker now. I'm considered what's called a DevOps Days core organizer. I was the only American in the first DevOps Days in Ghent. I've been on a core organizer committee. I started the first DevOps Days in the U.S. I've just been involved. I'm also known for the person who's been to the most DevOps Days ever in the planet. So, like I care, but I don't care if you go to my DevOps cafe. I don't make any money off of it. Me and my friend Damon Edwards, actually, I'll get there in a second. We've been doing this for like 6 years. We don't even take sponsor. We're idiots. We don't even take sponsorship money. We just do it for the love of it. But the beauty of it is the people we interview are amazing, absolutely amazing. And so we have some Adrian Krakoff. I mean, I can go through the list, but so that's this. So the agenda today. If you want to write down, the OW.ly, but if you just remember that, UZIBE, that's a list of all the presentations. Actually, I've done over the 5 years, but more importantly, a lot of the stuff I'm going to reference today, the longer version of each one of these things. And they're important topics. I could spend an hour on each one, and I did. So I will also tweet this out later. In fact, as soon as I finish the presentation. So that's my Twitter handle as well, Botchagaloop. So I will tweet out this presentation and then a link to all those other presentations. But that UZIBE will be the best. So the idea is I've been asked a bunch of times this year to do State of the Union on DevOps. And so I've got a couple that I did in Chicago. But this one, like I said, I wanted to combine not just State of the Union, but kind of everything cool that happened this year. So we'll talk about something called the DevOps Survey, what's happening with DevOps in the large enterprises, because that's a very interesting story. Something I'm absolutely fascinated right now is something called Kata. And then I always say, oh yeah, if we have time, we'll actually talk about technology. I suspect the other people, most today, will talk about a lot of technology stuff. So I'm going to probably douse you on a lot of culture. So it all starts in 2009. I went to the first DevOps Days in Ghent. Patrick DeBar really addressing this kind of concept of Dev and Ops as a holistic view. He coined the term. He ran a first conference. I was there. I came back. I decided we needed to run one in the U.S. I was already doing a podcast with my good friend Damon Edwards. And after the first U.S., so there were 30 people at the first one in Ghent. There were 300 people in Silicon Valley a year later, 2010. And after it was over, we did a podcast. We just tried to figure out what the heck happened. 300 people just crazy enthusiastic. It's like a renaissance. And I've been doing this at that point for 30 years. And like to me, this was like everything that I thought should have been the way it, for years I did work and I just felt like I should be selling shoes because like we're just not moving the needle in IT. We get customers spend lots of money, they spend lots of money and things never work. And all of a sudden there were 300 people just excited as all get out about things that might actually work. And I was at Chef at the time. And so we actually accidentally created this, I call it a loose taxonomy called CAMS. Culture, Automation, Measurement, and Sharing. And over the years, people have used this a lot. And the things that I always say, you'll hear people say, without the C, don't bother with the AMS. Literally, don't bother with the AMS. And I'll tell you some more stories later that the tools are awesome, but without the right behavior patterns and culture in an organization, in fact, in some cases, they'll make you worse off. I wrote this blog article. It's on the Chef blog site. It's still there that same year. It stood the test of time. If you Google what DevOps means to me, it's still there. But here's the thing. When I was in Chicago, I was asked to do kind of a 2015, this was in the summer this year, a kind of a catch-up on the State of the Union. And I thought one of the things I've been thinking a lot about over the last 2 years now is complexity. And I'll talk a little about complexity here in a little bit and how it interrelates with what we do and particularly DevOps. And a lot of what you learn when you start studying complexity, complex systems is it's all about feedback loops. And what I realized is CAMS was really a feedback loop. And I didn't realize that until this year. In that, your culture basically defines your automation. Right? We talk about Conway's Law, if you've ever heard of that, right? That's usually for a programming paradigm. But it's also true for your automation. The culture is, by definition, is what defines. And so if you talk about things like continuous improvement or continuous delivery, continuous learning, continuous collaboration, this is a basically feedback loop of culture feeding, defining automation. If you're doing it right, you're actually behaving like scientists, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. So you're measuring everything and deciding what to do with results. Now, I will say, as an industry, we suck at this. I don't know how that word translates into German, but suck at this. Right? And I'll talk more about that. And then sharing, we're pretty good. We're pretty darn good at the sharing. Like that is like, I think, early you saw companies like Facebook, Amazon and Google, they didn't share as much at first. But Facebook came out and just started showing how they were doing their infrastructure. So it is a feedback loop. But, earlier this year, a good friend of mine, Dave Zwiebach, really kind of came up with another taxonomy that I love. So CAMS has been around for like 6 years or so. And Dave said that DevOps is really this ice, and he wrote it for O'Reilly Radar. And Dave is pretty famous. He runs. You should get him over here. He runs these blameless postmortem workshops, and he's just written a good book called Beyond Blame, which is actually available on Amazon. But he called it ICE: Inclusivity, Complexity, and Empathy. And I thought this is. I still like my CAMS because the culture trumps everything. But I do love this ICE. And if you think about what we've done in DevOps over the last 5 years, but maybe really over the last couple of years, I think we've done some good things with diversity. We've invited, we've done a better job. It still disheartens me to walk in a room and see 5 women in the room. Right? We've got to do a little better here. It's like that in the U.S. too. Like, we have to strengthen diversity. In the U.S., we work hard at it. We really do. And I'm not saying you don't do it here, but we really have, we've included a lot of recent women in our core organizers, Bridget Calmheit, Jennifer Davis over at Chef. The enterprise has really brought in. I'll talk about this. The security group that we have really good buy-in from the RSA, the DEF CON people. They actually ran a track at RSA on DevOps, and I'll talk about somebody who's done a lot of work there. And then I've been trying to really push. My startup was a network company. We did SDN for Docker, and so I've been really pushing the kind of network community to buy into this DevOps thing, right? Imagine network switch configurations stored at GitHub that run through a CI loop that actually use Cucumber to do testing on the back end, right? Like of a switch, like an Arista or a Cisco switch, right? Wouldn't that be cool? I mean, there are people doing that. So the security people created a movement called Rugged Software. And one of the things I loved about what they did is you'll see a lot of people try to change the name of DevOps. Like everybody's screaming, what does DevOps mean? It doesn't have a meaning, so why do we use it? Let's call it DevSecOps. Let's call it Dev Marketing Ops. So let's not change it. It works. It's a stake in the ground. It's a metaphor. DevOps, wall in the middle, there's that picture. And we can live with that. And we can I think we're imaginative enough to say dev could really mean other groups. So we can still call it dev and not be like, and so what the security people did is they didn't change the name. They said it's called Rugged DevOps. And you go to rugged.org, like amazing stuff going on there. Some of the top security people are dealing with this, and they even created a Rugged Manifesto. And there's a gentleman called Josh Corman. I'll speak about him a little bit later. He works at Sonatype. He's done some amazing stuff in the DevOps movement. All right, so that's the inclusion, short version of the inclusion. And then the kind of C in ICE is complexity, right? So we've really embraced complexity in DevOps over the last couple of years. In fact, Adrian Krakoff was mentioned earlier. So Adrian Krakoff was the primary architect of a company called Netflix. Actually, you get Netflix over here, so that's kind of cool. So they have this thing called Chaos Monkey. How many people have heard of Chaos Monkey? Quite a few. For the people who haven't, Netflix runs such a robust. So there's this idea of embracing failure. And so in DevOps, we have this idea that we want to embrace failure. We want failure to happen because it makes us stronger. And in Netflix, they actually run a process that kills servers, production servers, on purpose. Now, here's the thing, though. You don't just race home from this conference and go say, hey, we ought to run this thing that kills servers in production, right? You have to have some things in place. And Adrian Krakoff and crew was smart enough to read a book by Mike Nygaard a few years ago where he defined something called circuit breaker patterns. Just like a circuit breaker in your house, if a transaction blows, it doesn't create a cascading effect. Sidney Decker, there's a gentleman called John Osbar who has invited a lot of these human factor, human safety people. These people have nothing to do with IT that have now come into our DevOps community and having a great discussion because they're the kind of people that when a plane crashes, they go in and try to figure out what was the human error in the plane crash. Did the wrong button get pushed? Or the two buttons too close to each other so that in a panic you hit the wrong button? So we've had a nice embracement of people. Sidney Decker, we had him on our podcast. He actually was invited to a keynote down in Brisbane last year, the DevOps Days. His field guide to understanding human error. In fact, Adrian Krakoff, when I asked him, how do you build an architecture like Netflix? He said, all I do is got the right books to the right people. So he got release it to the architects. He got field guide to understanding to the operations group. And then Mark Burgess has written a book called In Search of Certainty, a lot about complexity. I don't spend too much time on this, but it's worth looking into this. It's called Cynefin. It's a Welsh pronunciation. It's a framework for dealing with complexity. And it's interesting where we're seeing a lot of this play out, right? How many people have heard of Kinevin? One person. Hey, it's an extremely, David Snowden, you might want to look it up, but the place where it's showing up in our kind of DevOps community is, there's a few people that are running these blameless postmortems, and when they do in the postmortem on the outage, they're using Kinevin as a framework to decide to figure out where, and you have basically things that are kind of what they call obvious. You have things that are called complicated, and then you get into complex domains where they're emergent. Your behavior, how do you deal with it, are different from something that's obvious, as opposed to chaotic, which is like a black swan, right? Again, very short description, but it's well worth understanding this. And then finally, the E is empathy. Jeff Sussna, he wrote a blog earlier this year called "Empathy is the Essence of DevOps," and it's one of those blogs where you say, God, Doug, I wish I would have thought of that. Because, I mean, we were hovering all around this for 5 or 6 years. He just nailed it. But what we mean is, dev and ops is an empathy, right? Like what we try to do in ops is try to empathize what the developers think. And the developers try to think about what the ops would think. Right, and we try to think what marketing would think and what sales would think, right? And so empathy is a big part. I've been working on a book with Gene Kim, Patrick Dubois, and Jez Humble for about 4 years now, due out in March. But I wrote the section on something called embedded engineers, and this is an early, still a very good hack if you're trying to build up DevOps empathy. You put like an operations person actually in the development team. They become part of that team. And so they have kind of, they kind of swirl around a little bit more DNA about how operations thinks. And then the safety call, blameless postmortems, that's if you haven't heard about those, you need to talk about it. This is where you, like nobody is to blame. There is no human, it's always a system. Dr. Deming said that 94% of every problem is the system, guaranteed. 6% would be a human. In fact, the truth of the matter is there are companies now like Etsy and Netflix that basically believe that 100% of the problem is the system. It's always the system. Even when some idiot breaks something unbelievably horrible, the chances are that they weren't trained properly. And that's a system problem. And so empathy is really about, inclusion and complexity. Inclusion is about listening. You're actually hearing, if you're in ops, what dev has to say. If you're in dev, listening to what ops has to say. Complexity is all about feedback loops. Any way you can get them. Monitoring. There's, again, Kinevin is a feedback loop. OODA loops, if you've ever heard of John Boyd's OODA loop, right? There are tons of examples of feedback. And then, how many people have heard of the Phoenix Project? So quite a few, right? Gene Kim's The Phoenix Project, right? That's a great book. It's a novel. And when you read the book, you will say, if people haven't read it, you will say, how did Gene sneak into my company? Because that guy works 3 cubes away from me. We've been working on 4 years. Gene tells me we're going to have this out in March. The date on this is October. It's been pushed back to March. But the goal of this has always been, it's called the DevOps Handbook, to be the prescriptive guide to the novel. So it's due out in March. In fact, I have the final copy, doing final edit reviews right now. So, and then this is that Jeff Sussna guy I talked about earlier who described empathy. This is an amazing book. I would call it DevOps UX for Dummies. I guess he didn't want to call it that, but if you think about, like, how do you develop service in the form of user experience with the thought of complexity and empathy as part of all that, right? It's a brilliant book. I mean, it's funny, I get a lot of books from friends, and I actually dread getting books from friends. Because if the book sucks, then I have no idea how to tell them, especially when they're close friends, that the book stinks. And this happened to be one of those books I'm like, oh no, I like this guy a lot. And if this book stinks, I don't know what to tell him. And the book was amazing. He talks about cybernetics, which is another really interesting model for complexity. Does a complete, really good base level of complexity. Again, I really think that book. Another thing that has happened in the U.S., I don't know, we have, a very vibrant DevOps community all around the U.S. And in Los Angeles, I've been involved in the Los Angeles. In fact, it's one of the areas I kind of started up as well. And in the beginning of this year, a young gentleman who I've gotten to know over the last 3 or 4 years at a conference committed suicide. And I wrote a blog article. It just tore me up because he was a young, beautiful man. And I thought about, in our industry, are we abusing ourselves, or certainly abusing our young, brilliant engineers? Are we overworking them? Are we putting too much stress on them? Are the situations, particularly people in operations, right, where you run operations for a hospital, or you run operations even for something like Uber? Like, I always say, imagine Uber 6 years ago, somebody raising their hand and say, hey, I'm going to create a company that's going to put all taxis out of business. Oh yeah, good luck with that one, buddy. Right? But now you run operations for that company where their goals are just beyond belief, right? So anyway, I spent a lot of time, some of my presentations earlier this year were about burnout. It's an important thing to think about in our industry. We're all very, chances are most of you in here, probably all of you, are very passionate. Why would you come to a DevOps conference? Just be careful about your passion and your work-life balance. All right, so moving on, less depressing things. For about 4 years, Gene has been running, in conjunction with Puppet Labs, something called the DevOps Survey. In 2014, it kind of got real. And the first 2 years were very small numbers. In 2014, the data started showing up to show some really kind of true indicators of, is this DevOps thing working? Is it really, 6 years ago, when I started, I can say I've been doing DevOps for 30 years, and a lot of people would say that. The term was coined 6 years ago, right? So, you might have been doing something else, but it wasn't DevOps. But we had some assumptions that there were things about this that worked and worked well. There was a reason why we put culture first. We truly believed that there were things that if you behaved a certain way, that better success will happen. And what was great about the 2014 survey, it showed some data. Some of it echo chamber, but still it was the first pointing to data that all these things we talk about with culture, actually are showing some indications that you will be a higher performing organization if you do these things. By the way, Toyota figured that out 50 years ago. All right? And blew the crap out of every American car maker for about 30 years. Just destroyed. Buying an American car in 1990 was a really stupid thing to do. The joke was that, I remember this, in the 80s, so I'm old, right? In the 80s, the thing is, you would buy a new car, and the day you bought your car, that afternoon you would find a dedicated mechanic. That was it was like your doctor. You gotta I got a new car, better find a mechanic. And then all of a sudden, this company out of Japan started making these cars where the only thing you had to do was put gas in it. And it worked. Anyway, so we figured out something, again, Toyota figured out 50 years ago, that high trust organizations, that high performers that were high trust organizations, they were cross-functional and collaborative. They shared responsibilities and they embraced learning. And in 2015, Nicole Forstrom, we just did a podcast with her. She works over at Chef now, but she's a true data scientist. She actually taught statistics analysis, did a PhD, And she got heavily involved in 2015 survey. But here's some of the things, right? DevOps, for people that are new to DevOps, like some of the things that when you're trying to, like, I get it, now you got to explain it to other people. There are all these counterintuitive ideas. Like if I deploy more frequently, it actually makes me better. Oh, wait, 100 deploys a day? How could that not destroy everything? How could that actually make my change and problem resolution go down? And so we found in 2014, this is done by statistics, though, too. This is not just numbers. I mean, Nicole has been involved in both years, and if you want to listen to the gory details of how she does cluster analysis to prove this out, to create low, medium, and high performers, based on how you answer the question, that in 2014 we found that people that deploy more often, that deploy software more often, in fact, 30 times more, the high-performing cluster group deployed 30 times more often than the low-performing group. And in 2014, their mean time to resolution was 48 times better than the low performers. Again, that sounds so counterintuitive, but once you understand that doing large waterfall, wait 6 months and drop it, is way more, things break and they're much harder to figure out. And then we found out that their resolution or their change ability was 3x. But here's where it went nuts. In 2015, the high performers were 168 times better at their mean time to resolution. How good who gives a, I'm going to curse one time. I normally curse a lot, so who gives a shit how good you are at predicting failures? Honestly, mean time to detect. Does it really matter? Because in a complex environment, what really, really matters is how good are you at resolving the problem. Because that's the time that counts. You're a financial trading organization. How long you're down is the real number. The DevOps Enterprise in large organizations like Disney, Target, it's a big U.S. retail. I think you're number 2. Nordstrom, Barclays. They're all showing up with really solid DevOps stories. None of it's easy, and they'll be the first ones to tell you it's very hard. But these are large companies. So one of the debates that has happened over the prior 2 years has been that, yeah, John, this DevOps thing is awesome, but and mostly this comes from large consulting companies that usually come into your organization. Again, no disrespect to people who work for these kind of companies, but they come into your company, and what are the first thing they do? They put 4 project managers in your company before they even start touching anything. And they're the ones that have been arguing for the last 2 years that, John, this DevOps thing is great, but it's got to be done differently in the enterprise. Sorry, I lied. Two curses. Bullshit. Right? Because like 2 years ago, I wasn't sure. I mean, I knew they were wrong, but then I saw companies like Target and Disney and Nordstrom and Barclays show up at our DevOps Enterprise Summit and tell the story of how they're doing exactly the same way Etsy and Facebook. Harder, because the enterprise is definitely harder. I mean, Facebook is one application, a PHP application. It's a very complex PHP application with a lot of brilliant people who work on it. A bank is usually 17 or 18 business units. 400, 1,000 applications. But they're not taking any shortcuts. They're not buying into the large consulting companies that are saying, oh, yeah, that DevOps things, you're going to have to do it this way. In fact, Nordstrom basically said that, this is kind of cool, they said that they actually changed the model and convinced senior management that ROI, they're not living on ROI. They're going for speed. They've changed the whole model in operations to stop talking about return on investment. We did, I'll post this out later too. Gene has run these working groups. We spent 2 days in Portland. At the DevOps Enterprise Summit, you should look that up. We documented these 5 white papers. These are written by 30 of the top industry people working in DevOps Enterprise. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about, I referenced the kind of lead in Japan, and Jim Womack. I'm not saying, there's a lot of books here. The only reason I point his book out is this is the guy who basically at MIT figured out why Japan was one of a few people, but one of the primary people who figured out why Japan was beating the hell out of us. And a couple of things that came out of it is there's these Japanese terms, but they're so important. It's something called the Gemba. And Gemba is where things happen. And one of the things that Toyota did really well was they basically had this kind of concept of you never accept a call and say, hey, what happened down there? Oh, yeah. Okay, well, let me know when it happens again. You went to the place where things were happening. If something was broke, you stopped the line. That's Jidoka. And they had this concept constantly you'll hear about go see, go see, go see, go see. Gemba was the place to go see. They talked about Kaizen, which is continuous improvement. And ultimately, I just finished, this is one of my favorite books I've read the last 5 years. Mike Rother. Mike Rother also wrote a canonical book called Learning to See, which is value stream mapping, which is another incredible tool. But this book he wrote, Toyota Kata, and he talked about the problem which everybody tried to study what the Toyota was doing. But nobody was looking, they were looking at the wrong things. They were looking at the tools, the processes. What they weren't looking at is the invisible things. What Toyota was doing for 50 years, maybe 100 years, depends on when you start, was they were building behavior. You know, we use the word culture, but what culture really is about is behavior. So again, when I use the word CAMs, what I'm telling you is the successful companies actually have this autonomic behavior that they don't even know what they're doing. It's like karate or judo or kabuki theater. You know, if somebody was to come up to the right and I was a karate expert, which I'm not, arm would go up like this. It would be an autonomic behavior. So imagine you work in an organization where you have these goals to be great at something, and then everybody in your organization basically does that as an autonomic behavior. Case in point, Bethany Marcy in 2013, DevOps Days New York, gave a presentation on a tool she wrote for Etsy on a postmortem system. So outage, you do a blameless postmortem. At 27:40 in this video, she gets asked a question. The question is, and by the way, Etsy is a poster child for DevOps. If you didn't know that, look it up. John Osbar is CTO over there. She gets this question, and the question is, how do you ensure that when you do a blameless postmortem, the action items assigned in the postmortem, that what to do after, actually get done? She looks at him and she says, she's stunned. She says, I have no idea how to answer that question. And then she stops. And one of the things Rother talked about when the Americans went over to Japan to try to figure out why they were beating the shit out of us, 3 times, but they'd ask these questions and the workers couldn't answer the questions. They didn't understand these simple questions. One question was, how come you have to use a mallet to bang the door in when you fit it in? And like there's a story of this isn't in Rother's book, but there's a famous story where the American workers can't understand where's the mallet, the rubber mallet that you have to use to make sure the door fits. And the Japanese workers sitting there going, what's a mallet and what are you talking about? And finally the Japanese worker figures out and says, oh, I get what you're saying. No. We have this thing called variation and statistical process control. We figure that out way down the line. We know it's going to fit when it's designed. And here she didn't understand this because Etsy, that would be impossible with their culture for somebody not to follow up on an action item in a postmortem. And if you get a chance, watch it. It's amazing. That's autonomic behavior. Etsy is trying to build a culture to do. They create arts and crafts. They're like an eBay for arts and craft, and they say we like to create awesome systems for people who create awesome stuff. And Aristotle says we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is an act, but is not an act, it's a habit. And a couple more stories when I squeeze in. I'm running out of time. In Rother's book, so when Toyota had this thing called the and-on cord, anybody could stop the line. Any worker. So the lowest level person could stop a massive multi-million-dollar processing line. See that rope up there? And so here's the thing, right? In Toyota, if you pull that thing, the first thing that would happen is your manager would come over to you and thank you. They wouldn't yell at you. They wouldn't say, why'd you pull the line again? Even worse than that, there's a story in Rother's book where there's a particular plant in Japan, Toyota City, where they're doing 1,000 and-on pulls a shift. Now, Western culture, we'd be like, oh my God, that's horrible, right? For about a 2-week period, it goes down to 700. And again, Western culture would be like, break out the champagne, and we're just down to 700 defects versus 1,000. CEO calls in all hands, says, we got a problem. And he says, we should be pulling 1,000 and-on cords a shift. And we're like, what? And he's like, we're learning. So to them, failure was a learning opportunity. So that meant they were learning 300 times less a shift. Think about the counterintuitive nature of that type of thinking. But that's the kind of thinking, the companies that think like that, they win. High Velocity Edge, I got one more story to tell you. It's a good companion book. If you read Toyota, if you read this book, Toyota Kata, I totally recommend reading this book right after it, High Velocity Edge. And so High Velocity Edge has great stories about Toyota, behavior, autonomic thinking. Paul O'Neill, he was he eventually became our Department Treasury head, but he was brought into Alcoa, right, the guys that make aluminum and all, and their safety record was horrible. I mean, just a lot of deaths. So they said that chances are at least once in a lifetime you were going to know a worker who died before he got there. And one of the things he did, he basically put in a kata. And his kata was that, and in fact, he shows up for the first board meeting, stockholder meeting. And the first thing he says is, instead of saying, we're going to get to revenue, we're going to do this, we're going to be second in the market, we're going to do all that bullcrap, he says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have 0 on-the-job injuries. Like, are you out of your mind? And he says, and they're like, in fact, the analysts, the financial, they just destroyed him. Like, how come he's not talking about shareholder value? How come he's not talking? He basically instituted a policy that within 24 hours of any on-the-job injury, he had to be notified. It changed the whole nature of how they learned and how information flew back opposite. In a lot of American Western culture, we have command control, we have a drill down type. This forced a reverse flow. They said if you put $1 million into Arcola when he got there, it was $2 million when he left. Changed everything. Technology with 1 minute left. I have done a fair amount of presentations this year about what I call immutable infrastructure or immutable delivery. I believe that Docker, microservices, and something called data gravity are this unbelievable convergence of how we're thinking about infrastructure. You think about IoT, and you think about data. So I've got a couple. If you wrote that on link or you follow my Botch group later, I've done this a couple of times early in the year. Guns, Germs, and Steel, based on Jared Diamond's where it's really guns, germs. It's actually containers, microservices, and data gravity, and how if you think about those as a new model for doing infrastructure from a technology standpoint, after you get the culture right, can be pretty awesome. And Adrian says faster, cheaper, safer. I'm a big fan of Adrian Krakoff. He's one of my heroes. A lot of people who have helped me throughout the year. That's all I got. Well, thank you very much.